So here I am again, just literally 30 minutes later in the video just recorded. And as you can see, the sun is just about to make an appearance, and once again I'm sailing Sunrise, the JP80, which won the Fastnet 4 years ago. 3 years ago, sorry, and we are delivering it back to Dublin after the Round Island race, which is both retired, which is fun. And we are just going around Land's End, and ahead of us, although you can't see it, is Several Stones, which is to the east. Sorry, to the east of the Scilly Islands. And just about where we are at the moment is close to where in 1979 a massive depression passed across the Fastnet fleet of boats and created real havoc. The third night of the race, and most of the smaller boats were in the RSC. Some of the bigger boats were already close to the Fastnet lock, and some of the very big boats had already gone round. And for the smaller boats, a lot of them were just north of the Scillies when this very low, very deep low across the RSC, bringing a wind which veered massively over a very short period of time, which created a very, very complicated sea state and winds up to 50 knots for a pretty short period of time. I was myself Sigma 33, and I'm just 19 years old. We were doing okay in the race, although we were one of the smaller boats. We were probably a bit quicker than the Contessa 32s. There was the OOD 34s, which was a new 34-foot race boat, which was doing quite well, and we were one of only a couple of Sigma 33s. Anyway, so it was getting late in the evening, beginning to get dark, and the wind was getting up, and I remember we put a couple of reefs in and changed down to the working jib, and I had to go up to the top of the mast to check one of the halyards which had been twisted around the forestays, which was probably my fault actually. So I hauled up the mast and untwisted the halyard and brought it back down. That was all very good. And as it got dark, the weather deteriorated rapidly. And in a Sigma in those days, we didn't have a deck there, as it was called. We didn't have any GPS, we didn't have any way of navigating apart from dead reckoning and maybe a bit of radio direction finding. And we pretty much knew where we were. We were heading towards the rock. We'd heard the weather forecast. The start of the race had been fairly light actually, and we hadn't really expected there to be a massive amount of breeze. At the moment we were expecting to put a couple of tacks in on the way to the rock, and then we'd go round, and then we'd probably have a run home and spin again. Anyway, as it got dark, the weather started getting very, very rough and very, very windy, and we realised that we were in for a bit of a blow. And at that point, there was 6 people on board, three people down below. I was on deck with a couple of crewmates. one of them was getting a bit seasick. He went down below, and at that point we thought it was just going to be, you know, a pretty dark, wet, rather windy night, but ultimately everything looks better when the sun comes up, exactly as it does now. Everything looks better in the morning, so we thought that would be fine. However, what actually happened was that the sea snake got really, really, really bad. We were realising that we were not able to cope with the sea snake and the sails that we had up. So at that point, we decided that we should take the jib down and put the final reef in the main. And really, at that point, we were not racing any longer. We were really just surviving, and we'd borne away, so that we were really sailing almost south. So at that point, it was pretty dark, probably about midnight, which is the darkest hour really, I suppose, midnight to 1 a.m. And the boat was taking a lot of grief over the bow, over hugely every time a gust came, and the edge of the boom was going into the water, and I was in the cockpit with my rudimentary harness in those days on, which was basically just one of those big clips onto a canvas sort of harness, which you went around your body, separate from your life jacket. Which is pretty basic as well. Anyway, I think one big wave put the boat right over on its side, and I heard a bit of a clang and smash from down below, and realised that, you know, some of the movable items, and I think the cooker itself, came out of the gimbal and just sort of landed in a heap. Which wasn't great with the gas pipe on it. I think that was okay because the gas being switched on the cockpit, as everybody always does. Anyway, down below was a bit of a mess. Everything was upside down from that sort of knockdown, and the boom was right in the water and not quite sure how the boat went over. But it was enough for us to realise that this was not really going to sustain itself by continuing in the right direction. So we finally got the mainsail down and strapped away and got the boom on the side of the deck. So we were now without any sails up. And we turned around now so that we were basically running for the storm as best we could because of the mast and the deck and the sails flapped up and on the foredeck, etc. There was enough windage for the boat to make a few knots downwind in this massive following sea, which meant we were basically steering down the waves and just trying to keep the boat from rolling, you know, almost 45 degrees, 50 degrees from side to side. And there wasn't really much more we could do really apart from hold on. I was in the cockpit and one of those big waves came and rolled the boat. I actually got thrown right across the cockpit and over the guardrails into the water, but held on by my harness, and I grabbed the guardrail itself, so I was sort of submerged for a few moments as the boat went over, then came back up, and as it came back up I managed to jump and pull myself, you know, further into the bottom of the cockpit. And of course, you know, when you're 19, you know, you've got plenty of strength and you're able to do that. Although I think that must have been, you know, fairly sick actually. Very, very rough. Anyway, it's pitch dark, and there we were. We were probably roughly where we are right now. We were sailing downwind, and ahead of us, somewhere ahead of us, was the Scillies, and Seven Stones. And I think I said, look, we really need to know where the Scillies are. Can't be that far away, and we need to know where Seven Stones are as well, because on this heading, we need to go north of Seven Stones to get into the lee at some point of the Scillies, which of course shouldn't give you much lee at all really, but it might be just the wave height, because that's the wave action was coming from the west. In actual fact, the wave action was from two different directions due to the fact that this low pressure was coming so rapidly that it upset the gradient breeze, the gradient seaway, and created another massive amount of wave action, which meant it was, very, very awkward. And luckily, because we were a pretty small boat, we went a few miles further north, where a lot of the damage was done and a lot of the people lost their lives in the very confused sea and the huge gusts that came through. Anyway, I was on deck and straining myself, my eyes, trying to see a light, trying to see the Seven Stones light. And I sort of said, well look, if we don't see this light pretty soon, we can't continue running without any sails up, without any communications, because the VHF had stopped working. And that was the only sort of VHF communications we had on board. We would then have to try and stop the boat. In other words, we'd try and, we'd have to stop sailing south and sailing down the wave and actually turn the boat and in effect heave to, which was like, how do you heave to when you haven't got any sails up? So it was a bit of a jeopardy moment really. We were running, we were just in a following sea, going towards, on a course of, exactly sure what the course of steering was, but it must have been around 240, something like that. Anyway, I was lucky to see a flash of a light, and I realised that was the Seven Stones, which was basically on our port bow. So I knew that as long as we bore away a little bit, we could leave Seven Stones to starboard. And this is before TSSs and other shipping channels. So we knew we had a free gap between Land's End and Seven Stones, which to aim for. Of course, by then it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was you were beginning to see a little bit more light. A lot of cloud, very dark, a lot of rain as that depression came through. But it was definitely getting less windy, if I remember rightly. It was 1979 and it's now 2026, and that's a long time ago, but some of these things you do remember. Anyway, by the time dawn came, the wind had gone right down really to about 20 knots, and the cloud cover had slowly disappeared or come less, and we began to tidy up the boat a little bit and work out what was happening, and we realised that the rudder was tiller, there was a sort of click bang every time you moved the wheel. And we realised that there was been some damage somehow to the rudder stock, although no water was coming in. However, there was a lot of water down below. Mainly it was the fact that when you take the sails down and you got the hatch open, you got people around and you had the leeward winches in the water. Things get wet. So the boat was pumped out the best we could, and we made good everything on board. By the time it was 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and the sun actually started to break through, believe it or not, and the wind had gone down again, we were the main up and the jib up, and we were sailing, quite nicely towards Falmouth. And I think at about 10 or 11 that morning, we actually put a spinnaker up, and we actually sailed on the spinnaker into Falmouth harbour in the early afternoon, I believe. Well, I can't quite remember. And as we came up the harbour to find a berth, because we thought we'd better stop to check what was happening with the rudder and just dry out before we obviously intended to make the passage back to Hamble at some point, knowing that we'd retired. We were all a little bit disappointed because it was actually quite a nice day, and we'd had to retire from the Fastnet, which is not what you want to do really after you've prepared for it and done all your work and sorted it all out with the crew together. So we were a little bit miserable. And as we went up the harbour, the harbour master came along to ask us whether we were one of the boats in the Fastnet. We said, yeah, we are one of the boats in the Fastnet, and we disappointed that we had to retire. And he went, well, would you be happy to be alive, mate? He said, because he then told us a story about the lifeboats, the Scilly's lifeboat, the Falmouth lifeboat, the Lizard, other lifeboats, the helicopters, the Caldros coming out with the Sea Kings and the Wessex Fours coming out to pick people up, and we were just completely amazed because we just thought we had had a bit of a nasty night, done a bit of damage, and retired because we'd had to turn around, and there was no point us continuing because we'd have been lost had we continued, because we had to turn around in the middle of the night. Anyway, as you can imagine, when we found out what had actually happened, we were very, very sad about the whole race. And it wasn't until later on in the afternoon, I think, I actually got round to phoning parents, my mother, and saying, hey, we're in Falmouth, we're okay, because obviously by then there'd been a huge amount of press and information about exactly what had gone on, and obviously it became one of the biggest losses of life in a boating accident or a racing accident ever. So that's where we are right now, really, and it's sobering thought, really. Sobering thought.